All right, hello everyone. So today we're going to look at some advanced astronomy in an ancient text and also some advanced geodesy. So we're going to look at examples of advanced astronomy and advanced geodesy coming out of the ancient world, going along with our thesis that perhaps over the horizon of history is some advanced world civilization or something like that. So I think we can start here looking at, we'll give a little bit of a frame here. This is Yggdrasil. This is the world tree of the Scandinavian or Norse traditional culture. And several cultures around the world have something like a world tree. And there is also with a similar or even identical symbolic meaning, we also find cosmologies in the ancient world, like in the yoga tradition, with world mountains. So sometimes a world tree, sometimes a world mountain, and occasionally even a world pillar. This is the Dagon tribe in Africa. They have a world pillar. But whether pillar, mountain, or tree, one of the symbolic meanings here is that this is the axis of the earth. So what do I mean by that? If you draw a line, an imaginary line between the North Pole through the center of the earth to the South Pole, the earth is spinning on that axis. So then if you project that line, that axis, up to the pole star, Polaris, the northern star, this is the axis of the earth, you could say, coming from the Polaris, the North Star, all the way down to the North Pole, through the center of the earth to the South Pole, and into the southern celestial realm, the southern stars, the southern sky. So this axis of the earth is represented by the world tree, the world mountain, or the world pillar. So the idea here in Yggdrasil is that going up towards the pole star, towards Polaris, that is Asgard. That is the region of the gods, the realm of, that's like heaven. Like in the Greek literature, that's heaven. And coming down into the underworld at the roots of the tree, that is towards the southern sky. And then in the middle, this Midgard, that is the equator of the earth projected out into the cosmos. Okay? So just grab that in your brain as a sort of framework here. Like we hear in ancient Greece, right? The gods are on Mount Olympus, or in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Lord lives on Mount Zion. Or in the Vedic or yogic tradition, the gods are living on Mount Meru. Mount Meru. So, like this, the top of that axis, represented by a mountain or a tree or a pillar, going up towards Polaris, the pole star, that's where the gods live. That's the divine realm. And Midgard, or Bhuloka in the yoga tradition, this is the earthly regions. Bhu means earth. The earthly regions are projected out along the celestial equator, out into the cosmos. And then the underworld, or Patala Loka, or in the Norse tradition, it's called hell, that is down to the southern stars, like Canopus and Sirius. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the two main yoga texts, you've got Krishna giving two paths, the Devayan, the divine path, and the Pitrayan. Pitri is cognate with our English word patriarch. Means the forefathers, the ancestors. So the divine path is going up towards the pole star and the seven sages, and then the pole star. And then the Pitrayan is going down into the underworld, the realm of the dead, and then is coming back. In other words, the Pitrayan is the path of reincarnation, being born again and again. And the divine path is sort of back to the spiritual world, you could say, or back to heaven, back to the kingdom of God, something like that. And that's going towards the pole star. So you have these kind of astronomical references, but presented in an ancient cosmological model, which requires a little bit of sort of study to understand what that means there. So in the yoga tradition, they call this tri-loka. Tri means three, and loka, location. So the three worlds, or the three locations, the upper world, up towards the pole star, the earthly realm, spread out along the celestial equator, and then the underworld, the Patala Lokas, down towards the southern stars like Canopus and Sirius. Okay. So there's an ancient book in the yoga tradition, in the yoga literature, called the Bhagavat Purana. And in the 5th canto, chapters 16 to 26, I'll leave a link in the description below. You can access that book free online. And I'll put a link in the description below. There is a description of basically Midgard, but in the yoga tradition that's called Bhumandala. Bhu refers to the earthly regions, and mandala is suggesting a sort of circular pattern. Like you can have a Buddhist mandala. You put it on your wall and it'll have like a circular pattern there. So this Bhumandala, the earthly regions now, so sort of like Midgard in the Norse tradition, one of the correlations, one of the symbolic meanings is correlating Bhumandala with the solar system. So if you look at this image now of Bhumandala, the pillar in the middle, that is Mount Meru. So again, that's the axis of the earth, right? And then you've got these concentric circles going out. And these concentric circles are correlated with the perigee and apogee of the planets in our solar system. So what do these two words mean? Perigee means the closest a planet ever gets to Earth. The G is Earth, perigee, apogee, like geology, geography. The G means the Earth. So perigee, the closest a planet ever gets to Earth, and apogee, the furthest a planet ever gets to Earth. So if you imagine, let's say, Venus. So Venus is going around the sun, the Earth is also going around the sun. In their relative motions, motions between Earth and Venus, sometimes Venus gets very close, only about, I think, 25 million miles or something like that. And sometimes Venus is very far away, about 160 million miles. So this difference between being close to Earth and being far away from Earth is represented in this Bhumandala model by these concentric circles, that on the inside of a dvipa, or a concentric circle, is the perigee of a planet, and then further out, one of the further concentric circles, that is representing the apogee of a planet. And in this way, the Bhumandala model is correlated with the solar system. Now, oftentimes in ancient literature, we get information which is very difficult to in any way sort of compare with modern science. So like, say, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. You've got Achilles traveling into the underworld, for example. But how would we test that? Or we've got the goddess Athena appearing to Odysseus, and they're having a sort of conversation. It's very difficult to shine the light of modern science on these kind of statements. Like, I was just reading Hesiod's Works and Days last night. So you've got Zeus, the undying ruler of all men, standing upon Mount Olympus and, saying such and such. We can't really do anything with that. scientifically. However, in this Bhagavat Purana, in the 5th canto there, in that section that I referenced before, what we have is distances. So the distance between the earth and the sun, the distance between these various concentric circles, these dweepas going out from the earth. So because we're being given in this ancient book very precise distances, that's something that we can correlate with modern science, with modern astronomy. So I think we'll start with that today. So in this Bhagavat Purana, it says that the distance from the axis of the earth, from Mount Meru, to the center of the sun in its orbit, or in our orbit around the sun, the distance is 10,950,000 yojanas. So yojana is an ancient Indian measurement, and according to the research of Dr. Richard Thompson, it's about 8.5875 miles, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the only real thing we need here is if we can, as Dr. Richard Thompson attempted to do, accurately define the definition of the yojana. What is that unit of measurement that in ancient India, in this Bhagavat Purana, they are calling the yojana? Then if the book says the sun is 10,950,000 yojanas away from Earth, then if we can just put that into miles, then we can check it, or we can compare it with modern astronomy. So I've gone through a little exercise doing that, sort of following along the lines of Dr. Richard Thompson's work in Mysteries of the Sacred Universe. And basically, let's just go through this step by step. The first thing that he does is he spends a lot of time researching and providing the sort of lines of evidence, lines of reasoning, to establish what is this unit. What is a yojana, basically? So he uses 4 lines of evidence, and they all sort of converge to a single conclusion, that the yojana in the Bhagavat Purana is 8.5875 miles. I'll give you one line of reasoning, just so you can see sort of what he's doing. There was an historian, a Greek historian in the 1st century BC named Strabo. And Strabo is giving us information about another Greek from a couple of centuries before, around the time of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. And Megasthenes, this historian, was also something like an ambassador to India. So he went and spent some years in India. He wrote a book about India called Indica, and Strabo is talking about Megasthenes and that book. So from scholars like Livio Stachini, we know what the Greek measurements are at that time. So for example, Megasthenes is using a measurement called a stadia, and we know what that distance is. And then Megasthenes has gone to India, and he's saying such and such amount of stadia equal a yojana. And coming to the conclusion that the yojana of the Bhagavat Purana is 8.5875 miles. Now, just to make the math a little simpler, I just rounded that up to 8.59. And so all I've done is, coming off of Dr. Richard Thompson's work, I've just taken the measurements listed in the Bhagavat Purana to these concentric circles and to, the distances correlated between the Earth and the planets in our solar system and the sun. I've taken those distances in yojanas and just multiplied it by 8.59 so that we have those distances now in miles. And then I've taken the Bhagavat Purana and I've compared that with, I just went on the NASA website. The NASA website has all the information about the solar system. I also checked it with another ephemeris program called inthesky.org. But one of those two, or both of those, I was using to get all the modern astronomical data. So the sun in the Bhagavat Purana is 10,950,000 yojanas from the earth. And that's actually the distance from the axis of the earth, Mount Meru, to the center of the sun. To the center of the sun. So we'll have to subtract the radius of the sun there so we can match it to NASA. Anyway, so if you take 10,950,000 yojanas and you multiply that by 8.59 to get how many miles that is, that turns out to be 94 million miles, roughly. And then because that's a measurement to the center of the sun, I've got to subtract the radius of the sun so we can compare it with the NASA website, which is giving the distance to the surface of the sun. So you subtract the radius of the sun, which is 432,000 miles, and we end up with the Bhagavat Purana, ancient South Asian sacred literature, giving us a distance from the Earth to the Sun of 93.6 million miles. Then on the NASA website, it says 93 million miles. So 93.6 million miles in an ancient book, and 93 million miles on the NASA website in modern astronomy. Now, if we look here, just briefly, to give you a sense of the history of astronomy in our Western tradition over the last couple of thousand years, I've given the Earth-Sun distance here. So in the 2nd century AD, Ptolemy is presenting that the distance between the Earth and the Sun is 5 million miles. And that basically is the best astronomy that's known in the mainstream Western tradition for about 1,500 years. Then in the 17th century, you've got Kepler using the sort of naked eye sightings of Brahe, Tycho Brahe, and coming to the conclusion that the sun must be at least 14 million miles away. Then a couple decades later, you got Cassini. Cassini is getting very close now, 87 million miles. And finally, about 170 years ago, only 170 years ago, we're coming to the 93 million mile mark. And then we consider that this ancient text, which is bringing knowledge from sort of over the horizon of history, is presenting a very accurate figure. Interesting. And it turns out, just to, spoiler alert, that all the correlations there, the perigee and apogee of Mercury, Venus, Mars, and the asteroid belt, as well as the perigee of Jupiter and the apogee of Saturn, which is all the correlations that are given there in the Bhagavat Purana, all of them are quite accurate. And this has not been known in our modern astronomy to the last 100 or 200 years. So I'll just go through a few of those with you, just so you get a sense of it. So let's start from the first planet coming away from the sun. Let's start with Mercury. So again, perigee means when Mercury is closest to the Earth, and apogee means when Mercury or some celestial body is the furthest away in its relative motion from Earth. So on the NASA website, it says that the Mercury perigee is 48 million miles, and that's correlated with the inner border of Shakadweep in the Bhagavat Purana, which is 52.8 million miles. So about an 8% or 10% differential there, quite a lot. Most of the rest of these numbers are a lot closer. Then you've got the apogee of Mercury, listed on the NASA website, as 137.9 million miles. And in the Bhagavat Purana, the correlation is 135.3 million miles. So that one's within maybe 2% or, about 2%. So, difference. So then let's look at Venus. Venus is very well correlated. The Venus perigee on the NASA website is 23.7 million miles, and that's correlated with the inner border of Krancha-Dweep, which is 25.3 million miles. The Venus apogee on the NASA website is 162 million miles, and the outer border of Pushkara Dweep is 162.8 million miles. So that's very close. That's about half of 1% difference. And in this way, Mars, the asteroid belt, Jupiter, and Saturn all are correlated very well in this ancient text, the Bhagavat Purana. So, as we presented last week with Flavius Josephus, there's some evidence for you of advanced astronomy in the ancient world, in the ancient yoga tradition, and let everybody do with that as he or she sees fit. The basic theory that we're working with here, we're approaching this whole sort of theoretical area, is that at some point over the horizon of history, perhaps 5 or 7 or 10,000 years ago, or perhaps further back, there is something like an ancient worldwide high civilization, something like that. So what I'm doing here last week and today is sort of going with that theory. All right, our ancestors are telling us that over the horizon of history there was a high civilization with advanced knowledge, very virtuous, strong, beautiful, long-lived. All right, well, let's theoretically, hypothetically go with that. What would we expect to find? Well, we would expect to find some remnant or some evidence that they had high civilization. For example, advanced astronomy, or wonderful megalithic architecture, or very sophisticated languages like ancient Greek, Persian, or Sanskrit, or any other sort of advanced science, something like that. So another thing that we're going to look at today is another example of advanced science coming down over the horizon of history. And this is in the form of metrology or geodesy. So geodesy means, that's not a common word, geodesy is the study of the size and shape of the Earth, especially since the Earth is oblate. It's not a perfect sphere. It sort of bulges out at the equator, and the poles are flattened a little bit. So if you have very accurate measurements of this, measurements of latitude basically, of the accurate measurements of the curvature of the Earth, represented by latitude, if you have accurate measurement of latitude, then you have accurate measurement of the Earth, basically, something like this. And perhaps for a moment, we'll just segue here to the metric system, just so I can give a modern example of this, and then we'll look at ancient examples. So the metric system was begun in 1791 in Paris, in France. And the meter, or let's start with the kilometer. The kilometer was defined as 1/10,000th the distance from the equator to the North Pole. So this is called a meridian quadrant. Quadrant as in 1/4 of the way around the Earth, from the equator to the North Pole, and meridian meaning a line drawn through the poles, not a line drawn this way, a line drawn through the poles. So 1/10,000th of the meridian quadrant through Paris was defined as the kilometer. That is what a kilometer is, basically. And therefore, a meter is then 1/10,000,000th of the meridian quadrant through Paris. So this was the definition of the meter. And then, of course, you have kilometer, meter, centimeter, millimeter, micrometer, nanometer. You have a whole thing there. And not only just length, but also volume. So if you take, say, a cubic meter, now you have volume. And if you fill that cubic meter with water, now you have weight. You have a metric ton. A metric ton is a cubic meter of water. Just like a liter of water, 1 liter of water, 1/1000th of that, is a kilogram. So from length, you're getting your length from a neat, even division of latitude. So you've measured the Earth, you know latitude at 1791 Paris, so we're coming into the modern world. We've measured the Earth successfully, and now we're using the measurement of the Earth, we're using latitude, and we're dividing that 90 degrees of the latitude going from the equator to the North Pole, dividing it by 10,000, giving us a kilometer. From the kilometer we get the meter, the centimeter, millimeter, and so on. And then we're using that length derived from latitude to create volumes, like a liter, and to create then weight. So a liter of water weighs 1 kilogram, like that. So in this way, the metric system is there. Now, what scholars like Livio Stachini, Julius Oppert, Dr. Richard Thompson, Randall Carlson, Schwaller de Lubicz, what these gentlemen have basically done is shown practically unlimited examples in the ancient world, both in literature and architecture, that in ancient societies, people are using, just as we do today with the metric system, neat, even divisions of latitude as their units of measurement. So maybe we look at a few examples just to give some sense of that. So here is Old Kingdom Egypt. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza, perhaps the most recognizable piece of architecture on the earth. And the perimeter of the base perimeter of this pyramid at Giza is exactly 30 seconds or half a minute of latitude at the equator. So for example, how do I do that? So let's go 1 minute of latitude. 1 minute of latitude at the equator is 1,843 meters. So 1 minute, 1/60th of a degree of latitude at the equator is 1,843 meters. And the Egyptians are using what Schwaller de Lubicz calls the Egyptian, one of the 3 Egyptian fathoms. The Egyptians are using, like we have the meter, the Egyptians are using a measurement about so big, fathom, 1.843 meters. 1.843 meters. So this is precisely, to the millimeter, exactly 1/1000th of a minute of latitude at the equator. Right? And if you look at the perimeter of the pyramid at Giza, exactly 500 of these fathoms, 1.843 meter fathoms, make up the perimeter of the pyramid at Giza. Perhaps here's a drawing, or here's a image here from Randall Carlson, which may sort of make that a little easier to visualize. So from the work of Livio Stachini and Schwaller de Lubicz, we don't just see this accidentally once in the pyramid of Giza. Rather, we see that the entire Old Kingdom Egypt is laid out using these neat, even divisions of latitude and longitude. Therefore, the conclusion would be somebody, either them or their predecessor coming before them, somebody has very accurately measured the Earth, including the equatorial bulge and the flattening of the poles. Somebody. I'll give another example from Schwaller's book, Schwaller de Lubicz's book, The Temple in Man, and I'll leave a link to that book in the description below also. And I'll do that for Mysteries of the Sacred Universe, the Bhagavat Purana. Maybe I'll leave a link to some of Randall Carlson's online presentations. Anyway, I'll put all that in the description. Excuse me. So, Schwaller de Lubicz, he studied, I think for 9 years or something like that, he studied the temple at Luxor. And he called that the Temple of Man, or sometimes the Temple in Man. And he measured one strange room there. what he calls the strange rhomboidal shape of this room. And what he's referring to there is that it's not a perfect square. The northern wall is about this much, about 200 millimeters, 20 centimeters, longer than the southern wall of that room. He spent a couple of days measuring it very, very carefully, right to the millimeter, both walls and pillars and all sorts of other things in the room. And what he saw was that on the southern wall, for example, which measured 22.115 meters, so 22.115 meters, that if you use that Egyptian fathom that we spoke of before, the 1.843 meter fathom, precisely 1/1000th of a minute of latitude at the equator, 12 of those goes into the southern wall. If you multiply that fathom by 12, you get the precise to the millimeter measurement of that southern wall of that room in the Temple of Luxor. So 12 thousandths of a minute of latitude at the equator. And that the northern wall, being slightly longer, 22.34 meters, is precisely 12 fathoms if you measured the fathoms at the latitude of the North Pole. And that is 1.8617 meters. So in other words, I'm not giving some exception here. I'm giving two of many examples that Schwaller presents in his book and in his other work. Excuse me. And also Livio Cecchini, and in other words, they're giving thousands of examples like this, that the whole Old Kingdom Egypt is built very accurately and very sort of strictly along latitudinal and longitudinal lines, and that even the measurements of the walls and pyramids and temples and all these ancient architectural structures are measured very precisely in neat, even divisions of latitude, just like we have today with the metric system. And the conclusion or the suggestion or the indication there is that, well, somebody, whoever came up with these units of measurement, has very, very accurate measurements of geodesy, very accurate measurements of the oblate shape and size of the earth. This is the idea. All right, thank you, my friends. This presentation has been derived from the late, great Dr. Richard Thompson and his book, Mysteries of the Sacred Universe. And that book is research on an ancient yoga text called the Bhagavat Purana. So I'll link both of those in the description below. And also a thank you to the wonderful Randall Carlson for all his online material. Thank you very much. Like and subscribe if you appreciate this content. Thank you.